2019 is over, and I've had plenty of time to think about what I consider to be the best and the worst for both video games and movies, for both mediums. And specifically when it comes to the worst for video games, my list really comprises of a bunch of games that had a lot of expectation and failed to live up to those expectations. But I also have games up on my list that were covered in mass by gaming journalists in the general media that have been overpraised and given so many accolades that are quite frankly undeserved. And so I will be discussing what I believe is the top 10 worst video games of the 2010s. And of course, every single game on this list is a big budget AAA release. And in order for a game to be considered on this list, I would have had to play and completed the game. And I've played and completed every single game on this list. So, starting off. At number 10, Kingdom Hearts 3. Now, this is an interesting one because when it comes to Kingdom Hearts 3, I actually don't think it's necessarily a bad game. But when you factor in the fact that Square Enix had a good 12 some odd years to make this game and make it the best thing it can possibly be, and the game comes out and it's a mediocre mess that's quite frankly unfinished, and then they have the audacity, they have the nerve to charge $30 for some DLC full of cut content from the game itself that should have been in there from the beginning. That's what makes this extremely insulting to anyone who is a fan of this series, which at this point has lost all of its creative flair. And it's easily one of the most disappointing video games of all time, if you look at it from that angle. Far more so than other releases from Square Enix, such as Final Fantasy 15 and Dissidia NT, which are also very poorly done, unfinished games. But with Kingdom Hearts 3, it's just too much, too far. It could have been a lot better than what it turned out to be. My number 9 is Shadow of the Tomb Raider. So, this is the end of the most recent Tomb Raider trilogy, which began this console generation. This was supposed to be the big conclusion to Laura's story, and unfortunately, it ended on a lackluster note. This really suffers from the third installment syndrome, where you had a really good first entry, and then you had an even better, bigger sequel, and for whatever reason, the third entry just could not stick the landing. They just did not get this right at all. There were a lot of issues that I had with the gameplay, just the overall way the combat system was designed, and the game was just straight up unfinished in certain areas. And you could tell that they cut a lot of corners to meet the deadline so the game would be released on time, just before the holiday season. And to make matters worse, Laura, as far as her character goes, her development really is non-existent in this game. They did a much better job of that in Tomb Raider 2013 and Rise of the Tomb Raider. Yeah, unfortunately, this did not stick the landing, and it's easily one of the most disappointing games that I played all decade. At number 8 is Assassin's Creed Unity. And this game is one of the more polarizing entries on my list. Assassin's Creed, the last truly great Assassin's Creed game to me, and to a lot of other people as well, was Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. That was really the last time Assassin's Creed really had any true quality to where it can be considered to be among the best when it comes to video games. And Assassin's Creed Unity really ruined that. This was a game that was rushed to market. It was technically an unfinished mess of a game. The story was horrible. It was very cliche, and they repeated a lot of different plot elements from the earlier games in the series. Gameplay-wise, this is also one of the worst entries in the series, if not the worst entry in the series. The combat system is just absolute dog shit in this game. Clearly not a whole lot of thought went behind it, And the exploration wasn't good either because they cluttered the map with a bunch of NPCs, which made exploration on the ground just annoying. And there was just a lot of different issues with this game. A lot of people lost interest in Assassin's Creed after the release of Unity, to the point where Ubisoft was forced to do something new in order to potentially have the series continue, while at the same time, retaining the popularity of the franchise. And that leads me into my number 7. Assassin's Creed Origins. So, a lot of people really love this game. This is one of the more popular entries on my list. And this game was way overpraised by gaming journalists when this came out. This game was getting high-ass review scores across the board. I just don't understand why. Because realistically, this is one of the most boring, one of the most repetitive, and one of the most poorly designed open world games that I've ever played or seen in the market. The one major thing that I did like about Assassin's Creed Origins was the story, but the gameplay was so monotonous and just so redundant and mindless that it really didn't matter, how good the story actually was. Another thing about the story is that it really didn't matter because if you were not invested in the story of the Assassin's Creed series to begin with, then the story really is something that didn't make a whole lot of sense anyway. And gameplay wise, like I said, this game is just very repetitive, monotonous, mindless. The combat system is shit. The game is way too big. It's cluttered as hell. The RPG elements that they added pretty much ruined the entire thing. The game is just bloated as hell because they were trying to copy the success of other popular RPG games. By trying to do that, they really lost the spirit of what Assassin's Creed is supposed to be, which is a strong adventure game that has, some decent action elements. Really an action-adventure franchise is what Assassin's Creed is, and this game completely went against that, just so Ubisoft could, copy other franchises in a completely different genre, which would make it easier for them to, earn accolades and shit that they really didn't even earn. Yeah, I don't like this game at all. Fucking awful game, and I have no hope for Assassin's Creed after this. So, my number 6 pick is Man of Medan. And Man of Medan is the next game that was released from developer Supermassive. And the previous game that they worked on before this was Until Dawn. And Until Dawn was critically acclaimed, and rightfully so. That's one of the strongest narrative-driven games. This interactive experience that's supposed to be film-like. And they did that in a very good way. But Until Dawn was also a very strong horror game. This game tries to follow in the footsteps of Until Dawn, but it fails on virtually every level. And one of the main reasons for that is because the story and the characters are just not good. They're not well written, they're not compelling. You don't care about anyone in this game at all. Any of the protagonists, all of them are just not likable characters. The game is way too short, and they didn't have the budget like Until Dawn had to really make this interesting. To make matters worse, this is supposed to be part 1 of an anthology series, and they really have sparked very little interest from me as well as others for this series that they're trying to create. And Man of Medan is just a big disappointment all around. At number 5, Mass Effect Andromeda. So this is one of the absolute biggest failures of the 8th generation of video games. There was a lot of anticipation for this game when they announced that they were making a new Mass Effect game, because this is coming years off of the ending of Mass Effect 3, which universally was panned. A lot of people hated the ending to Mass Effect 3 and felt that it was so terrible that it ruined the story of all 3 games. And Andromeda was supposed to be the game to come in and completely erase that and start on a new slate, start fresh. And they completely fucked it up. The game was just way too big for what it was trying to be. It suffered from a lot of different technical issues. The story was not good. The characters weren't interesting. The combat system was okay, but the older games were better because they were more structured than what Andromeda was going for. The biggest thing, though, is the fact that the game felt lazy in a lot of different areas. It seems like the development team was being pulled in several different directions and nothing really came together. And that's really because this was a new development team who clearly was unexperienced, and they should have never been given the reins with this project. And this really was the major first step in the downfall of BioWare as a games developer. Terrible game, and it pretty much ruined what otherwise is one of the best RPG franchises of all time. So at number 4, I have the Order 1886. And this is definitely probably the biggest failure of a console exclusive, or at least one of the biggest failures of a console exclusive probably ever. Sony really didn't think this through when they decided to give Ready at Dawn, a developer that previously only worked on 2 handheld games, all this money to make this big AAA console exclusive. Because in reality, what this game really was just a tech demo for the PlayStation 4. It wasn't really anything that could rival any of the shooters that were on their competitors' console. This wasn't something that could go toe-to-toe with Gears of War, or even Uncharted, which is another franchise that Sony owns. This game has some of the most wasted potential that I've ever seen in a video game. And the thing that's most disappointing about the Order 1886 is the fact that they could have taken it in so many different directions than what they actually did. And this easily could have been a Game of the Year contender had they gone and made different decisions during the development process. And unfortunately, this game is just a casualty, a blight on the mark of the PlayStation brand. The term wasted potential is just an understatement. And that will be this game's legacy. So I'm down to my top 3, and my number 3 choice is Wolfenstein Youngblood. Now, this is a more recent game. It still baffles me how something like this could be released by a developer who has gained a reputation for releasing good products. The previous 3 Wolfenstein games are known to be some of the strongest first-person shooters that have been released over the past several years. So I don't understand why they thought that this would be a good idea. The characters in this game were extremely juvenile to the point of being unlikable. The RPG elements that were added to this game really hurt it in a lot of different areas because a lot of the enemies were just glorified damage sponges, and it just wasn't fun the way the previous games were. There wasn't a whole lot of emphasis placed on stealth, which was a big part of the gameplay from the previous games. And on top of that, it was really just a short demo that they decided to release, not for full price, but at the same time, the game just felt like a waste. And a lot of people hated this game. There was a lot of backlash against Wolfenstein Youngblood, and rightfully so. Whatever the next game in the series is going to be, I'm definitely not going to support it day one like I did with Youngblood, and it's because of this game that I'm really skeptical of Machine Games at this point. Just fucking awful game all the way around through and through. My number 2 pick is Resident Evil 6. And this has to be one of the worst, if not the worst, video game I have ever played in my life. Resident Evil 6, it's just so jarring that a company like Capcom could release something that's so messy, so dysfunctionally broken, just on a fundamental level, or even on a conceptual level. This game should have never been made, ever. This game is a perfect example of a company at a time where they didn't know what their target audience was, or they thought their target audience was more action-oriented, something completely different from what the series should be aiming towards. And to make it really bad, this game is actually the best-selling game in the entire series. and it's easily the weakest game in the entire series. It's the worst game in the entire series. Now, Capcom has since turned Resident Evil around and has moved in a much better direction, a far better direction, compared to what the series was back in 2012, because I was done with Resident Evil after this game. But look at what it took to get there. It took this piece of shit for them to decide and say, yeah, you know what, maybe we should, go back to the drawing board. It's like, you think? Yeah, at some point, I definitely should make a more personalized video around Resident Evil 6, because I'm not kidding. This is one of the absolute worst video games I've ever played. I hated this fucking piece of shit. And it's not like it's one of those games where, oh, it just gradually just got worse and worse. It's like, no, this shit was bad from the moment the gameplay begins all the way through to the end of the final level. It is that poorly done. Fuck Resident Evil 6. And now I'm at my number one. The worst and most disappointing video game of the 2010s, the entire decade. And my number one is actually one of the more popular games, if not the most popular game, when it comes to the circle of hardcore gamers, and especially gaming journalists. This is one of the highest rated games of the generation, and that game is...
Father, Father, do they call to me? Father, do they call to me? Father, do they call to me?
God of War 2018. To say that I dislike this game would be an understatement. To say that I hate this game would be an understatement. No, this game made me angry. Now, at the end of the day, when it comes to video games, they're entertainment just like anything else. There are games that I like, there are games that I don't like. There are games that I love, there are games that I hate. No, this game made me fucking angry. And it's because I was such a big fan of the original games in the series that I found it very jarring why they decided to take a new direction, and why that new direction was just so cliche and generic and copy and pasted from other popular games such as Dark Souls and The Last of Us, which were two of the biggest inspirations for this fucking mess. It really paints a picture as to what's wrong with the video game industry. I already knew before this game came out that it was going to receive high review scores across the board from your major video game publications. This game was an awards darling. It sweeped 10 out of 10 reviews from every major video game publication that published a review on this game. And it won Game of the Year. But what is it about God of War that I find extremely insulting? It's the fact that they decided to change what already was a great series. There was very little that was wrong with the older God of War games. They are some of the best video games ever made. They decided to change David Jaffe's original vision of the series in favor of something that is actually far worse if you compare the two. And here's the real reason why I absolutely can't stand this game. This game was not made for God of War fans, fans of the original games, the original trilogy, and the handheld PSP games, all of which pretty much play not exactly the same, but very similar. They're hack and slash games. No, this game was made for an audience that doesn't care for that sort of thing. Why would you make a game from an established franchise and completely target an audience outside of that fan base? They did this after the poor reception of God of War Ascension, at which most people felt that the formula was getting stale. And it was. So the series was shelved for a few years, and at this point, David Jaffe had already been pretty much kicked out of the industry. He stopped making video games, and so they got the guy who directed God of War 2, which to this day I consider that to be the best game in the series. They got him, this Cory Barlog dude, to come in and try and rework what essentially was not working. And what he decided to do is, once again, take elements from other popular games, and not just any popular random games that have been critically acclaimed. So once again, earlier I mentioned Dark Souls and The Last of Us. Both are considered to be some of the best video games released this decade. And they are, both of them, Dark Souls and The Last of Us. This guy decided to take elements from both of those games in particular, and he made the most generic and boring and just intellectually inept game possible. This game goes against everything that the older God of War games were about. No longer did you have linear, well-structured level design. Instead, we just give you a big, empty open world. There's no NPCs in there. There's no interesting side quests, although there's a lot of different side quests that's in the game. Now all of a sudden, they want to give you a dialogue simulator. We want a bigger emphasis on story, even though the story in this game is really stupid. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. A game about a grumpy old man and his annoying son, and they go up to a mountain in the middle of nowhere just so they can toss the ashes of some dead woman in the distance somewhere. Just random. And the ashes of the woman is this character that the game wants you to care about, but never develops. The combat system. It's a complete ripoff of Dark Souls. The same controls, the same overpowered damage sponge enemies, and they made it even worse with the camera, which is so close upon you, you can't really see what's to the left of you, to the right of you, what's behind you. It's one of the worst action games I've ever seen. And I've read comments online. I've watched videos of reviewers online who have admitted that they did not like the older God of War games, and they consider this one to be better than everything that's come before. This is a perfect example of what I hate about the modern video game industry. And it's to the point where I will no longer support Sony Santa Monica in any way, shape, or form. They ruined what's arguably my favorite video game franchise. And that is why God of War 2018 is the worst and most disappointing video game of the decade for me. And so that concludes the list, and I'm not so optimistic about video games after this decade the way I was after the 2000s. Although my top 10 best list gives me hope that video games will continue to thrive and still be of some actual quality going into the future. And so hopefully all these games on this list will be forgotten, shelved. God of War is a lost cause. But with certain things, I've already seen an improvement. Like I said, Resident Evil, maybe the second entry in the anthology series that Supermassive's trying to make, maybe that will be a lot better than Man of Medan. Maybe Machine Games will never make another game like Wolfenstein Youngblood. Only time will tell, to be certain. But until I see an improvement, I will continue to discuss and make videos about issues with the industry and the fact that quality, the level of quality that these things should be at, is not where they should be. But we can get there, and I hope we do.
More than that, the responsibility is far